And that started probably about 1300.
And some of the finest buildings you see anywhere in Europe are found in Europe, in Italy. They built magnificent churches. And not only magnificent churches, but universities. The university began in Italy. I think I said that last week. It didn't begin in North America. It didn't begin in Oxford and Cambridge or the Sorbonne in France. It began first in Italy. Why? Well, Italy was wealthy. Wealthy countries value education and build universities. And that meant that they produced vast amounts of culture. Painters, architects who designed the magnificent buildings in Italy. If you go to Italy, most of you have probably been there, it's extraordinary. Some of the most beautiful buildings in the history of Western culture are to be found in Italy. And many of them are churches. And part of that was due to the fact that the Italians were and are still proud of their Roman culture. After all, Rome once ruled the world for several hundred years. The Italians knew that, and they wanted to rebuild something of that culture. And ruins of classical buildings could be seen all over Italy, especially in the north and middle of Italy. So the Italians were proud of being descendants of the Romans, and they built many new buildings, and the universities as well. The university, as I mentioned last week, began in Italy. It began in Greece, it began in the Holy Land or Egypt. It was in Italy about 1300. And you can see some of the buildings built during the Renaissance at the universities. When I was in Bologna, and I think it was 1989, I'm not sure. Bologna was celebrating the 13th, let's see, not the 13th. It was it? Gee, I can't even remember now. It was celebrating one of the anniversaries of its university. I forgot now what it was, but they claim to have the oldest university in Italy. Maybe so, but there are half a dozen other cities that make that same claim. But the Italians were very proud of their universities. They wanted to recapture the glorious past that the Romans had built. And once you build universities, what happens to your population? People come from all over the world to attend the most famous universities. People at OSU from not just dozens, but scores and scores of countries come to Corvallis, a little town in Oregon, because we have a famous university. And that happened in Italy. Who founded the first universities? There were about 60 of them, I think. Who founded universities? Christians. Yes, it wasn't secularists. It was the Christians who wanted to teach not only scripture, but also philosophy. In the Catholic tradition, philosophy was very important. You read Aristotle, Plato, and you also learned other things that would help in the study of scripture. So Italy became famous for its universities. And a couple of important factors greatly facilitated the Renaissance. The first was the beginning of Greek scholarship. By Greek, I mean a rediscovery of the most famous works in Greek literature. And this happened accidentally or providentially, use both words, because in the end of the 11th century, Turks began to invade and to capture cities in Turkey. And in 1453, one of the greatest catastrophes in Western cultural history happened. The Turks captured the city of Byzantium. It was then called Constantinople, the city of Constantine, because Constantine had moved his capital there in the late Roman Empire in the 5th century. It was a disaster of major proportions. Not only were lots of people killed, but lots of destruction went on. And the Greek population, the educated population in Istanbul, I should say Constantinople, could see it coming because they were making gains all over Turkey. So many of the leading scholars left Constantinople and they moved to Italy. Why not France? Well, if you wanted west, you would sail to Italy. And they came to the major cities of Italy, and they brought with them manuscripts, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of manuscripts of books, mostly written in Greek. That was the international language for most of those scholars. And they introduced into European universities Greek. It hadn't been taught in European universities. There were virtually no Greeks, certainly not many scholars. So they introduced Greek. Latin was the international language of scholarship. If you went to a university in most places in Europe, you had the instruction in Latin, and you often spoke Latin. If you go to some Italian universities, you'll see the names of the guilds that they have from a variety of cities. And most of those people spoke Latin. That was the language of instruction. But Greek and Arabic and Hebrew were all introduced by the scholars that brought the manuscripts to Italy. And they took up positions teaching. And so that caught the interest of the people in Italy, and they liked the manuscripts and they wanted more. So they began making trips to Constantinople to buy manuscripts. And just to show you, if you're interested in looking afterwards, I brought some examples of this on your left is Ferngren's manuscript. This is a printed manuscript. I'll talk about it just a minute. Now, these were all produced by hand, written by hand, because printing hadn't been invented. But those are the kinds of manuscripts that people read. And this produced what we call an intellectual transfusion, especially the introduction of the Greek authors of antiquity, namely Plato and Aristotle. Those were the two most famous. And of course, the people where they came to Florence, or Rome, or Venice, couldn't read Greek. Hardly anybody could. So they established professorships in Greek, and no Italian knew enough Greek. So they filled them with scholars from the Eastern Empire. And hundreds of Greek writers began to come into the university cities. Florence was the most famous, but there were a half dozen others. And that produced an intellectual transformation. Who was the leading philosopher of the Middle Ages? Talked about it last week. Sorry? Well, okay, let me put it, the ancient philosopher was most influential. Aristotle. However, Aristotle didn't much appeal to the Europeans of the Renaissance. So they began to study Plato and produced a fascination with Plato and Plato's writings. His dialogues became available, and if you read Aristotle, he's rather dry in Greek. If you read Plato, he just draws you in. Many of you read any of Plato's dialogues? Which ones have you read? Okay. You probably read the Apologia, the Apology, and they're beautiful, and especially the one that records the death of Socrates, one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. Anyway, Plato was a fine stylist, and people didn't especially care for Aristotle, except they read him to get their philosophy. Plato just kind of enraptures you. And so Plato he replaced Aristotle as the leading philosopher of the Renaissance for several hundred years. And Florence became the center of Platonic studies. Platonic Academy was set up there, founded by Cosimo de' Medici, the tyrant of the city. And it was a kind of intellectual debate club, which caught the attraction of lots of people. And people in Florence tried to reconcile Christianity with Platonic thought. Why would they do that? Why not just let people read Christianity and read Plato in their spare time? Well, if you know the answer to that, you know the answer to all the other attempts to make Christianity and another philosophy or science agree with each other. Yes. Did you raise your hand?
Well, I was thinking that it was the combination of them feeling like they were being drawn into these people's messages and all that they had for thought.
Mhm, I think that's.
And because they were drawn into that, they wanted to see, well, does that agree with the Bible or
Mhm,
not? And
precisely.
so then by the time they made their comparisons, sometimes they just kind of found parts of the Bible that agreed with what they said and others they didn't.
Others they have problems with. That's the reason. So Plato largely replaced Aristotle as the most read Greek philosopher. And the philosophy, a particular philosophy grew out of this in the 14th century was called Neoplatonism. That is a Platonic way of looking at the world to which scripture was added. And part of this was that Neoplatonists believed that the world was beautiful and that the appreciation of art took on almost a religious flavor. And you see that in Renaissance painting. Look at one of the most famous, Leonardo da Vinci, but I would say a number of others, where you see a kind of a lovely painting which denotes an appreciation of beauty. And the appreciation of art took on almost a religious flavor. And that's one reason why so much painting was introduced at the time of the Renaissance. All right, that's the intellectual background in 5 minutes. You can't understand the Renaissance unless you understand the influence of printing on European culture. Printing was not known in the ancient or medieval world. The first person who invented printing was, as everybody knows, I think, Gutenberg. He was a German. Books were all hand produced, often beautifully produced. I have 3 pages that I have on my walls that were hand produced. 3 pages of different books. One is a prayer book. Anyway, if you're interested, come and look at it. If you look at these, you realize that it took hours and hours and hours to reproduce them. Every letter had to be hand inscribed, and they're decorated with flowers and a variety of various kinds of designs. All the books that were printed until Gutenberg came along were handwritten. That made them very expensive. Bibles in the cathedral were chained to the pulpit. Why? So they wouldn't be stolen. But that was the book world of the period before John Gutenberg. The art of making paper had begun in China. It had been invented in China before the birth of Christ. And the Arabs had learned it from the Chinese, and they had brought it to the 8th century to the West. And all this cultural transformation, not so much by the Greeks and the Europeans, but by people who brought it to them. Paper was cheaper to make than parchment. And so it began to be produced in large quantities, but the man who changed the world was Johann Gutenberg. He invented movable type, metal type that could be put in a block and a page printed, and then it could be removed and another page printed. It was a mass production of books. It had never been done before. There was a little bit of printing from wooden blocks, but it took so much time to produce that books were still expensive. And in 1447, whole page text and illustrations was made by Gutenberg, and then he began to print the most famous book in the world. What was it? The Bible. Yes. And I have a page here. In some sense, it looks like an ordinary book as was produced before then, but anything that isn't black was penned in. So if you wanted to give a little bit of illumination to it, you left those blank, say the capital letters, and they were panned in. This, by the way, is the 23rd century. And it was written in the universal language of the 15th century, which is what? Latin. Yes, every educated person could read Latin. Printing became popular after 1447. The 42-line Bible was his first book, and it drastically reduced the cost of printing. It could be done very quickly, but the earliest printers aspired to some of the artistic nature of the medieval scribes. And the earliest books, written from about 1450 to about 1500, often are very carefully penned the way this is. In the Bible that was produced, and the first one was called the 42-line Bible. I think there are about 300 left in the world. Have any of you ever seen a Gutenberg Bible? Oh, where, Andy?
In the British Museum.
Okay, thought you were going to say in the Louvre. That's the British Museum. You can travel to the Library of Congress and see one here. I have a book on that that tells all the museums where Gutenberg Bibles have been found. And it's kind of interesting. If you're interested in books, and anybody who knows me knows I am, it's interesting to read about the invention of printing and Gutenberg invention. So type and binding in elegant printing, books were printed. And by 1500, and by 1500, some 30,000 books have been printed. 30,000 titles, I should say. So his first printing was done in 1447. By 1500, there were 30,000 book titles and multiple copies, thousands of copies of each of these books. And by 1500, there were more than 1,000 printers in Europe and more than 10 million books. So you can see that was one of the major cultural revolutions of all time. And it accelerated the Renaissance by making Greek and Latin widely available everywhere. Why weren't German, Dutch, and English printed more? Well, they were, but the booksellers wanted to appeal to an international audience. And so they chose the lingua franca, which was Latin. And whether you went to University of Oxford or Salamanca or the Louvre in Paris, studied the same texts, same books that everybody read because it was the international language of Latin. And small editions were printed so that students could have them in cheap editions. You ever decide to collect these? They're called incunables, and people who own them and collect them. They're fascinating group of people. Collectors always are. Well, the Renaissance put Italy on the map of Europe, and the education which was invented, or I shouldn't say invented, but developed in Italy, spread all over Europe. It was mostly philosophical study, since in the Middle Ages, the main feature of the education was a curriculum called philosophy. Now, you could have philosophy in different areas. What was science called? Natural philosophy, study of nature. If you wanted to study almost any field, you went to Aristotle. He was called by the Greeks the master of those who know. That is the teacher. Why? Because he wrote on everything. His style was, he built his own school in Athens. He built a large courtyard, and he would cross from one end to the other, and he would lecture, and his students would follow him, I suppose, taking notes, which they produced. Aristotle became widespread and highly influential. Why did the medievals and later the Renaissance focus on Aristotle and Plato? Well, to provide what was called a liberal education, from a Latin word liberalis, which means a free man. It had nothing to do with having liberal opinions. It had everything to do with the kind of an education which would be given to free men. And to all those students who wanted to become men of distinction. So everybody learned Latin, no matter which university you studied at in Europe. Instruction was in Latin. You could be, as you see in Bologna, they used to have guilds, and you can see in the library guilds of the Scandinavians, the Swedish, the Russians, the English, all over and over, people who had come to Bologna to study the same thing and the same philosophy. And this became known as the Studia Humanitatis, the study of humanity. And it meant reading the ancient texts, especially Aristotle, but also Plato, and becoming educated men. So the Greeks became the models for upper class people, those who could afford to go to university. Education became secular, and then the kind of education was to give you an all-around education, a general education. And that it was all Greek. The Greeks wanted to produce well-rounded men. Women ordinarily didn't come, but they could study, often by private tutors. And even the kings had private tutors. So what kind of an education would you get if you went to Florence? Well, you would be fluent in Sumerian. You would have read all the Latin masters, Plato, Cicero, and Seneca. You would engage in philosophical conversations because that was the lifeblood of the way people ought to act. And you were supposed to have a view as politics, disciplined manners. You were supposed to have very graceful manners. You were supposed to be a gentleman, and that word comes really from the kind of education that was produced in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. So it became a new ideal of education, and it came to be called a liberal education because it produced men who would be men of great ability, knowing several languages, able to discuss philosophy, and although it was secular, it was assumed that it would be Christian, but the Christianity wasn't always in the service. The university had 3 faculties: faculty of arts, but also faculty of theology, where priests went to study, faculty of law, and a faculty of what was it? Can't remember. So this formed the kind of education that lasted in Europe and America until when? Some of you studied it in America. My age or older, 60s, 70s, 80s, before the universities of America changed. You took a liberal education, which was supposed to produce a gentleman, person at home in all fields, well-spoken, good writer, who read Plato in spare time. Oh, you must have had that kind of education. Now it's multiculturalism and good deal of indoctrination. Not everyone. I think that's minimal of Oregon State in many universities, and of course that's hotly debated today. I wouldn't be surprised if the modern education, multicultural education, probably has seen its last stand and replaced by something else. I don't know what that's. Okay, I'm still defining the culture, describing the culture. Gosh, I have to hurry. All this is to help you understand Galileo. The Catholic Reformation, or called the Counter-Reformation, had a major influence in Europe at the time of Galileo. And before that came Martin Luther, and that very famous date in our own history, October 31st, 1517. Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church. Have any of you ever been to Wittenberg? Oh, you haven't. The door is gone, isn't it? Yes, I'm kind of a Protestant pilgrim, so I look forward to seeing that. And Martin Luther ignited a fire that spread throughout Europe, spread especially throughout Northern Europe. And the Scandinavian countries all became Lutheran. Germany mostly became Lutheran, but Calvin had the greatest influence in France. He was French, and by people who went from there to England and especially Scotland. The Scots are Calvinists. They picked up the Calvinistic Reformed faith. But in Germany and Scandinavia, Lutheranism became the new version of Christianity. Poland, part of Hungary, part of Austria. Now, there had been attempts to reform the Catholic Church before the Protestant Reformation, but the sudden growth of Protestantism after 1517 produced a Protestant theology. All the Protestant reformers had been trained in the traditional Renaissance education. They knew Greek and Latin, and they were distinguished Bible scholars. I have a whole library of books produced by people who were Protestant reformers. They didn't all see alike, but they did have a particular system. The Roman Catholic Church had become very concerned about Martin Luther. And so they began to develop, what's the word I want? A schema for overcoming the reformers. And this happened partly by creating a court system, and it was called the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a system to do away with Protestantism. And it very quickly grew. The Inquisition spread out throughout all Europe. It came into Rome in 1552, spread throughout Italy, and the Inquisition was very widely feared everywhere in Europe. The Inquisition was an arm of the church. It spread to every place, set up its office. In Mexico today, I think Mexico City was the original place of the Inquisition. But it could arrest people who were suspected of having Lutheran or Protestant ideas. And nobody was exempt. It wasn't just college students and professors. Even bishops and archbishops, if thought to be Protestant, could be arrested, held in jail, and everybody under the Pope could be punished for this. Several hundred people were put to death in Europe by the Inquisition. Several famous people, including several famous scientists. I won't go down the list, but it put fear throughout Protestant Europe and even through parts of Catholic Europe. It was introduced into the New World. When I went to Mexico City, I was there for a medical history conference, and the center of the Department of Medical History was the old building of the Inquisition, dating, I think, to the 16th century. Well, it stifled attempts to introduce Protestantism into northern Italy and into the 3 Scandinavian countries, and I'm sorry, in many places, but not Northern Europe. I'm sorry, not Northern Germany, not the Scandinavian countries, not the Scots, because they all have the support of their rulers. Along with the Inquisition came the Index. All books that fell under suspicion of having heretical ideas were to be banned. And the censorship of books was given to the Inquisition in 1555. And the Inquisition published 40 years later its first edition of forbidden books. And they provided a means of producing this list and revising it periodically. So above the people who were placed on the list was the famous reformer Erasmus, considered the great man of European letters in his own lifetime. He fell into disapproval because most of his books were placed on the index. Copernicus's On the Revolution of the Heavenly Bodies, De Revolutionibus, was also placed on the index. When did he write that? Do you remember? I think it was 1523, wasn't it? There, plus or minus a year or two. One of the most famous books in the history of science, that was placed on the index. Do you know how long it took for it to be removed? 1835. I can remember when I was a boy and developed an interest in theology and other subjects. On my way home from school, sometimes I'd stop at the Bellingham Library. And what I was mostly interested in was theology, so I would go and look through it. I probably glanced through every book in the small library. And I noticed that if it was a Catholic author, it was listed as having passed the judgment of the Inquisition. And I didn't know then what the Inquisition was. I now know it came to be the case and was until maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, where every Catholic author should submit the manuscript to the Inquisition, have it read and approved, and then it could be substantiated. Did a great deal to prevent new ideas in every field from developing. And that came to an end in 1966. Was that late? The third part of the Reformation was the formation of the Society of Jesus. That was a monastic order, commonly known, its people were commonly known as the Jesuits. Founded in 1534 by Ignatius Loyola. He was a Spanish nobleman whose early life had been pretty reckless one. And he was serving the Spanish army and he was badly wounded. He asked for some books to read when he was in hospital. He was given two. One was the Lives of the Saints, and the other was the Bible. So he read both and he became a Christian. And he decided, which was common in the Catholic tradition, that he wanted to become a monk and dedicate his life to Christ. So he became a monk, and 1534, he brought 9 of his friends together and they formed a new order in the Catholic Church, a new monastic order. It grew rapidly, and by the time of his death in 1556, it had 1,500 members. And it became the most prominent Catholic institution for educating Catholics and fighting the ideas of the Reformation. Okay. Deal with a person. But Galileo is in the center of all this. Catholic Reformation, Counter-Reformation, as it's called in the Catholic Church. Galileo was born in 1564. He died in 1642. He was born in Pisa on the same day that Michelangelo died. And he died the same year that Isaac Newton was born. So he's an intervening person between what you said, the last of the High Renaissance and the first of the 18th century revolution in astronomy. One day in 1583, Galileo was sitting in a church in Pisa. You can do the same thing today. I have this thing I went into was look to see where the famous land was, because he must have been a boring sermon. It was in Latin, but he understood it. But he looked around and he noticed that a lamp in the ceiling was swinging back and forth. And he noticed that the ark was exactly the same. And so he spent the sermon looking at that, and then he came home and did some experiments to see if he could reproduce that, and he did. So he discovered the principle of the ark. That is, that the ark always takes the same length of time to swim. Now, he might have thought about it and forgot it, but Galileo wasn't that way. He wrote a treatise on it. And then he decided to make pendulums of all kinds. And that's what he did. He used primitive equipment. He timed the arcs as best he could. And he made a little device with an adjustable pendulum, and it was called a pulsologium. And you've probably seen them. They're sometimes used for doctors, or they used to be when I was a boy to take the patient's pulse. Have any of you ever been that? Yes. Just tells you something about my age. And then he went on to invent the other more famous thing, which was the pendulum clock. So that's due to Galileo. In the same year that he discovered the law of the pendulum, he was introduced to mathematics by one of the most famous Renaissance mathematicians named Stilio Ricci. And Galileo became so taken up by mathematics that he left medicine, which he was supposed to study. His father was paying for his university education. And at the age of 25, he became so well known for his work in mathematics that he was appointed a professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa. Not bad for a 25-year-old full professor with a high salary. Galileo was a Platonist, so that tells you a lot about him. He came to think that a knowledge of mathematics was essential to understanding the natural world. Haven't people always thought that? No, they haven't always thought that. Now you can't be a scientist without being a mathematician. He came to believe that not only was mathematics an essential tool for science, but that it helped provide a language for science. So he was given a full professorship, but he also opened a little shop for making mechanical instruments, especially things like a crude thermometer, which he invented. Took a hollow tube, he converted it in hot water, and he invented the thermometer. And that was the nature of Galileo. Everything he learned, he put into practical use. And, gee, we saw this a lot of time. He also happened to be fortunate enough to live in the period of the invention of the telescope. Sometime between 1604 and 1608, the Dutch lens maker discovered that you could put lenses like that, you could position them, and it was the principle of the telescope. And it took him a while to figure it out, but eventually he made the first telescope. And the idea was spread to Italy. Galileo discovered it. He made really the world's first telescope that was useful. And he was always looking to what we would call the academic and political nexus. You know, if you get a good invention, go to some official and see if you can get a government contract for that. So, with a good deal of fanfare, he held a meeting of well-known scientists, and he pointed out that through his telescope, they had 9 times magnification. And he said that this would be useful in wartime in spotting ships 2 hours before they would be available to the naked eye. So the industrial, what would you call it? Not just mechanical complex, but military, yes, military. So that was Galileo. He always liked publicity for the things he did. And he immediately went to work, made new improved versions, and he got interested in astronomy. So as the telescopes began to become more accurate, he began to take systematic study of the heavens, and he made a number of astonishing discoveries. In 1610, he published a little account called Sidereus Nuncius. It's the Starry Messenger, and it was a book that was intended for ordinary readers. He discovered sunspots. He discovered a new comet. He discovered mountains on the moon, rings of Saturn, phases of Venus, which he thought would be visible on Earth if Venus revolved around the sun. So already he had come to be a person who believed in Copernicus's revolution. That is, that the planets orbited around the sun rather than the other way. And he's famous for his experiments. He wanted to confirm all his ideas with his experiments. So he went up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa with some of his students and dropped balls down to show certain laws that he believed. For example, a 1 pound and a 10 pound body were landed at the same time. He came to the conclusion that everything on Earth and in the heavens were operating by the same natural laws. All right, so good. So far, so good. But he gained enemies in the church. A new star appeared in 1604, took Europe by surprise because Aristotle had said that no new stars, no new planets could come into existence. So he showed it to Cremonini, an Aristotelian philosopher, and Cremonini refused to look at Galileo's telescope. Why? Because he already knew the answer. And astronomical changes didn't take place. Some people thought it was an optical trick. And some people even said there's no reason to assume that what Galileo sees through his telescope is actually taking place. And Galileo went on to make another astounding admission, and that is that he had accepted the heliocentric theory. Now, where was the heliocentric theory at this time? Does anybody remember when it was invented, discovered? 1543. 1543, the book by Copernicus was published, setting forth the new theory. By 1600, there were only 9 people in Europe that thought it either likely or had actually happened. So despite the publication of that book, virtually no astronomers had accepted it. And most of those who did were in Northern Europe. And most of them were in, guess what religion? Lutherans, because it was a Lutheran person who had helped Copernicus publish it. The best scientific minds were almost conclusively against the Copernican theory. They thought it was something that mathematicians had come to believe. And in 1613, to get a little more publicity, Galileo published a book on the subject, a short book called Letters on Sunspots. And he, for the first time, openly defied the anti-Copernicans. But this brought him attacks from a group of very powerful Aristotelians called the Liga. The Liga was made up of many distinguished scientists, but it opposed heliocentrism, sun-centered universe, and absolutely refused to believe that the Bible taught that the earth goes around the sun. So, what should I do? It'll take me five or 7 minutes to finish this. Shall I do it or not? Okay. Okay, so Galileo wanted to make his views clear. And so in 1615, he published a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. Now, the Grand Duchess Christina was a very influential aristocrat, interested in science, popular public issues. And he wanted this not just to convince Christina, but as a means of getting his ideas in public. And he said that scripture didn't teach scientific theories. It taught scientific truth, but it used popular language in doing so. Now that's an important consideration if you're trying to find astronomy in the Bible. We'll talk about that more next week. In ordinary times, that would have brought not much opposition, but these weren't ordinary times. With Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church had armed itself with the Liga and with the Inquisition, and by publicly stating these things, even though he was a very distinguished Italian astronomer, Galileo provoked the Catholic Church. Now, if there hadn't been an Inquisition, he would have escaped unharmed. But the church was responding by what it thought was a concerted attack by a small group of natural philosophers and others. And So a year after the publication of that book, the most feared agency in Italy, which was the Inquisition, wrote a letter to Copernicus and made him meet with one of the most distinguished theologians of the age, a man named Bellarmine, who's, by the way, been sainted by the Catholic Church. He was an outstanding biblical scholar. Well, Bellarmine was very familiar with what he had written. He also knew much of the literature, especially Augustine, forward and backward. So he met with Copernicus. He met with Galileo, and they had several meetings, and Galileo thought that he should rewrite his theory so it was a probable theory, a possible theory, but it wasn't the truth. So that's what Galileo did, but he didn't write it in the right way, and he never gave up his idea that he was right in saying that geocentricity was wrong. Bellarmine, on behalf of the church, declared the Galileo theory, that is, that Earth and the planets revolve around the sun, and I'm quoting here, absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, because expressly controversy the Holy Scripture. That would make an interesting debate. Was Galileo right or not? Well, Bellarmine recommended that Galileo's book be suspended until corrected. And Galileo was told that he couldn't defend heliocentrism except as a hypothesis until it could be proved. A hypothesis was something that could be accepted or not, but it wasn't yet the truth. Okay. To make a long story short, Galileo was eventually brought before the Inquisition, and he was given a public trial, and he was eventually interrogated for 2 months. On June 22nd, he was sentenced by the Inquisition. That is the Fearful Inquisition. The dialogue of a book which he just published to give a popular reading to this, the dialogue was ordered suppressed, and Galileo, who was suspected of heresy, was ordered to be placed under house arrest and silenced. And at the age of 70, he knelt before a bishop and recanted. That is, recanted his heresy, and he was sentenced to an estate near Florence, and there he spent his last years. He got blind and died in 1642. But while he was there, he wrote his last word. It was a discourse on the two new sciences, which set forth very clearly the new theory, heliocentric theory, that the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun, as opposed to Earth-centered theory. And he stated it very clearly. Now, what was he going to do? He couldn't have it published in Italy because all the printers were obedient to the church. So he went to Holland, which was a Calvinistic country, and he went to a publisher there, and nobody asked any questions, and it was published. But because of its openness to new ideas as a Protestant country, Holland became a major book center for publishing even controversial books all over Europe. So he wrote his book in 1638, Discourse on the Two New Sciences. And in 1642, he died. Okay, we're still going to have to do 3 more minutes. Galileo is considered a martyr to intellectual freedom and a victim of the Catholic Church's hostility towards science. Now, that picture is a little bit of a caricature. I think you have to understand the trial of Galileo against the atmosphere of its own time. Part of the problem lay with Galileo. He was a vain man. He was a brilliant man, and he knew it. And he didn't suffer fools gladly. And he had a penchant for making enemies in high places, even with the Pope. He alienated Pope Urban VIII, who had encouraged Galileo earlier in his studies. And the Pope came to believe that Galileo had betrayed him, and so he turned against him. He had the opposition of the Liga, this group of very conservative scientists, or I should say natural philosophers, who hated Galilean politics, or I should say Copernican politics and theories. And by contrast with Northern European countries, such as England and Holland and Germany, there was not much intellectual freedom in Catholic countries. There was in Protestant countries because the Protestants didn't take the same attitude. They didn't have a church that tried to cloak off whatever hadn't been approved by the Pope. And so if he'd been born in Northern Europe, he would have had no problem with it. But he tried his best to cooperate with the church, but he was too strong a personality not to challenge it at one time. So what would you say about Galileo? Was he a revolutionary? Probably not. He tried to cooperate with the church, but he was caught in a difficult situation. Powerful personalities. They had turned their back on any progress in science that wasn't Aristotelian. And when Galileo pushed for a revolutionary change in astronomy, they turned against him. But just to show you how slow changes come, you should remember the date if you don't remember any of it. What was Copernicus's date of his publishing this book? 1543. By 1600, how many astronomers were there in Europe who accepted it? 10. Only 10 scientists, natural philosophers, who accepted that, the heliocentric view. But thanks to Galileo, by 1650, almost all educated Europeans, they accepted. So we have very powerful. Sorry to keep you. Thanks very much. If you want to come up and look at these two documents, so we get an idea of the difference between the old-fashioned thing by hand. And I've edited a book that has essays on all